and we're ready to start.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Neurology Grand Rounds this morning. I'm excited to introduce Professor Dan Lowenstein from UCSF. He's Vice Chair of the Department of Neurology. He's also the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost. He's been active all his life in pushing the bounds of curiosity, be it in epilepsy, genetics, or even just plasticity and how our brains develop and grow and change. He's a wonderful collaborator, a terrific teacher. He was honored with the choice from the UCSF students in 2013 to deliver the last lecture, which is an honorific for, if you had but one lecture to give, what would you say? That's on YouTube. It's worth watching. It's a wonderful talk. And hopefully there's plenty more lectures than Dan, and this is one of them. And it's wonderful to have you here this morning, Dan. Welcome.
Mike, thanks so much, and welcome everybody. Let me bring up my slides and we will start. All right, Mike, thumbs up if you can see the slides properly and you can hear me fine. Great, thank you. All right, well, I really appreciate the invitation. Mike, when he contacted me a couple of months ago, asked for the topics that I'd be interested in sharing, and I believe he ran those by at least a number of you. And the topic that emerged at the top was the neurobiology or the neuroscience of meditation or mindfulness. So that's what we're going to dive into. And this is, I think it's an always timely topic. It turns out that it's been in the last couple of decades that the various tools that have emerged to monitor the function of the human brain have enabled us to have some new insights into the neuroscience of meditation. Here's a now old Scientific American cover. But I think what's more compelling about this topic is meditation has been around for all recorded history. And we're talking 5,000 years. And for me, there's something to be said about a practice that human beings have adopted so consistently for such a long period of time. And although there are many insights into these practices, there's much, much more to learn. The other reason why I think it's even more timely, although this may be my own rationalization, is that this thing exists now. This device, which it's hard to believe, but really only emerged 15 years ago, 2006, I think, was the introduction, has completely changed the world as we know it. And I think if we could identify one thing that has altered human behavior more than anything recently, it's the fact that more human beings have this device in their hands and are connected to the world in a very different way. And so, you know, the ability for us to focus our mind, to attend to specific things has been, I think, inextricably altered with the creation of these new devices, which connect us to the internet and to one another in such a different way. And so what I'd like to do is cover at least 3 of these topics, maybe the 4th if we have some time at the end. So we'll dive into the neurophysiology of meditation. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on the notion of the unconscious mind, which everybody knows about, but as I'll make the point, I think is worth some additional focus. I believe that there's a really important connection between these meditative practices and racial bias, and I hope you'll understand that. And then finally, again, if there's time, I'd like to delve into the power of the mantrum, which is a particular type of meditative practice that is very, very tractable and available to all of us at any time. So I'm assuming many of you know about the practices of meditation. This is not a talk about the various approaches or kinds. There are many, but just in general, mindfulness meditation, which is the most popular here in the US, and for which many health professionals and others have been given the opportunity to understand, is really a practice that guides one's attention in a very specified way, that allows for regulation of emotion, that tries to enhance one's sense of self-awareness, and ultimately gives rise to a more self-regulated or equanimitous state. And practitioners and any of us who have worked on these practices will know that, number one, it's really hard to do, and there are these different stages. So what novices will find this quite challenging to do the practice, but with more practice, it becomes a bit easier, and the notion of trying to clear one's mind and stay focused becomes more apparent, and one's capacity to do this is even more. And then finally, that ultimate stage, which certainly I am lifetimes away from achieving, is being in a state where it's essentially effortless to just be in the moment. Well, I could not allow an hour of focus on meditation to go by without inviting all of us to actually have a brief meditation. So without any real extensive instructions, and regardless of your own practice, I'd like to invite you to join me for a 1-minute meditation, and I'll even make sure I time this. So here's all we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to find yourself, make yourself comfortable wherever you're seated. If you're sitting in a chair, keep your spine erect, your head up, plant your feet on the floor, feel the soles of your feet into the floor so that you feel grounded. And all I'd like to do for the next minute is to have us focus on our breath. So during this minute, we'll be taking in a couple of long breaths, and simply try to bring all of your focus into your breathing. And when your mind wanders, as it is likely to do, just try not to pay attention to those thoughts. Just let them waft away and bring your focus back to your breath. Okay, so here we go. All right. Well, again, this was more for us just to have the shared experience of sitting quietly and maybe bringing some peace and quiet into your day. In no way meant to convey any of the details of meditative practice, but it gives us a little bit of an entryway then into asking the question, like, what is going on in our minds, in our brains, as we are undergoing these practices? And so let's start. And I'll say that there is, as I alluded to at the beginning, quite a literature that's developed over the last 4 to 5 decades now related to the effects of meditation on the human body. And I'll start with some of the more systemic observations that have been made. So again, decades ago, studies looking at changes in oxygen metabolism and respiration were done, and there are definitely some changes that would happen, in part related to the alterations in the breathing that occurs during meditation. Measurements of arterial lactate and other changes have been documented. Studies looking at various flow into organs, focusing on vascular physiology, has shown a difference. And here, in fact, is one paper from back in the 1970s looking at organ blood flow. And on the left, you see controls. On the right, you see meditators, and measuring blood flow to the kidneys, to the liver, the heart, and other organs. In particular, non-renal, non-hepatic includes a very large amount of blood flow to the brain as well. And if you look at the difference between controls and meditators, what really stands out is that in the non-renal, non-hepatic blood flow, there's an increase in the rest period, shown in the red bars, by 12% in controls, but a significantly increased difference in meditators. So this was one of the first observations indicating that something different physiologically was happening to people who were meditating. Then there are other changes that have been seen. A decrease in sympathetic activity of the autonomic nervous system, changes in various endocrine hormones, neurotransmitters, and most relevant to us as folks in the clinical neurosciences, measurements and changes observed in brain function itself. And those first studies were done with the EEG. And this is, I believe this is one of the first papers in the 1970s. And this, as you can see, was about an observation of theta bursts in the EEG of individuals who were practiced in transcendental meditation. So this was a study of almost 80 meditators. They had been meditating for a long period of time. Most of them were teachers of transcendental meditation. They had a control group, and that control group was either planning on learning transcendental meditation or were volunteering for sleep experiments. Now, I'll show you this data. I'll emphasize that it, as far as I can tell, has not been well replicated. And it also comes from an institution that I don't know if it still exists, but one might suspect there could be at least something of a bias in the work, because it came from the Maharishi European Research University, which I believe has been connected to the transcendental meditation movement back in the 60s and the 70s. But nonetheless, this is what was observed: these high frequency bursts that were observed across all channels of the EEG in these individuals. And what the investigators observed was that, in fact, 21 of the 78 meditators showed this burst. They occurred about every 2 minutes with this short frequency, and it wasn't accompanied by any expressed subjective experiences related to sleep. So this was one of the first observations that at least there appears to perhaps be something that changes in the brain functionally during meditation. Well, there has been a number of papers since, which I believe have been done in a much more careful way, some of which has been replicated in other labs. But still, I think if there's one criticism of this general area of neuroscience investigation, it would be the lack of replication across labs. Nonetheless, this paper from Richard Davidson and colleagues represents, I think, a much more important contribution. And as you'll may be able to note, it was in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And Davidson's group actually has put out many, many papers done, as far as I can tell, in a very careful way. So this was a study of, as you can see, 8 very serious Buddhist practitioners. They had between 10,000 and 50,000 hours of training over the course of their lives, which was between 15 years of training and 40 years of training. I actually did the math on this, and this amounts for some of these individuals to an average of 5 to 6 hours of meditation per day. So we're talking serious. And what the investigators did was collect EEG during resting activity and then blocks of meditation. And the type of meditation done in this particular study was based in Buddhist practice, and it's unconditional loving kindness and compassion meditation, which I'll touch on again in a couple of the other studies. But this is a form of meditation in which one sits and focuses entirely on oneself, on others, others you know, others you don't know, others with whom perhaps you've had a difficult relationship with, and you extend compassion and love towards these individuals, and with the hope that it's increasing the compassion that we share with one another in the world. So this study, again, used the EEG, and what was observed was this high amplitude gamma activity during the meditation practice. And in the top part of the figure is shown the EEG signal, and you can see the increase from the resting state, which is in the first roughly 45 seconds, to the meditative state, which is the sort of the 3/4 of the tracing to the right. The bottom half shows the increase in time over various measures, and it includes what was focused on, which was synchrony between the hemispheres. And that's displayed here, which is what they describe as the hemispheric synchrony that was observed in the meditators compared to the controls. And if you look at the graphs, you can see that the synchrony was significantly higher in the practitioners. It changed from the neutral state to the meditative state in the practitioner, shown in the orange bar in the panel C in the middle part of this figure. And very interestingly, there was a correlation. Whoops, let's go back here. There was a correlation shown in the bottom. Sorry, my screen isn't advancing when it shouldn't be. The bottom part of the figure shows the measurements based on the amount of synchrony and the amount of meditative practice that these individuals have. And you can see there's a dose response curve related to the amount of history of meditation. So what they concluded was this gamma oscillation and this hemispheric synchrony was observed during the meditative state. It's the highest reported in the literature in a non-pathological context. It was clear that there was a difference in the profile even before going into meditation. That is, just when resting, one could see a difference in the meditators versus the controls, indicating that there was something beyond just the practice itself or just the timing of the meditation. And the conclusion was these differences in baseline activity suggest that the resting state of the brain may be altered by long-term meditative practices. And it's consistent with the notion that attention and affective processes, which the EEG, the functional changes may reflect, are flexible skills that can be trained. Now, again, from the same group, studies have been done extending beyond the EEG. And here's a study with a similar group of practitioners as we just discussed. But here, the technique was to use functional MRI to get an idea of the anatomical localization of the changes that have been observed. And I won't go into this in much detail. I show this figure just to convey the idea that there are clearly changes that were observed when comparing experts versus novices. The color mapping, those of you who do functional MRI will be familiar with the way these techniques are done. And significant changes were observed among non-meditators, folks who were novices and interested in meditating, expert meditators, and they also split the groups of meditators into those that had a relatively low amount of experience versus those who were sort of master meditators, if you will. And I'll just focus in on this one particular observation. And these are changes in bold signal in individuals over time with a focus specifically on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which in our frontal lobe is a very important region related to executive function. Again, something I'm going to come back to in a few minutes. But there was clearly a difference in bold signal during meditation in the meditators versus the controls. Although very interestingly, the subjects who had the most extensive experience in meditation, if anything, had a decreased signal in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, something that we don't really yet come close to understanding, but may get back to that effortless state that I referred to at the beginning when we talked about the general idea of mindfulness meditation. Well, another important paper came out now about 10 years ago that looked at the default mode network. And many of you may appreciate this network, which is also called the default network or the default state network. And this is a large-scale brain network that we all have, which is primarily composed of the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus. And it's best known for being active when a person's not focused on the outside world and the brain is wakeful. And this is like what we commonly do when our mind is wandering or we're daydreaming. So it was an interesting question to ask: what happens with the default mode network during meditation? And essentially, the message here is that there is decreased default mode network activation during meditation. This is shown here, a comparison of meditators and controls in the lower part of the figure. The different colors represent different types of meditative practice in this group. I think there were a dozen or so meditators and 13 controls. And one can see that there is changes in the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate gyrus, cingulate cortex. Again, noted in meditators, but not in controls. And interestingly, if one focuses in on the components of the default mode network in particular, again, the medial prefrontal cortex and the insula and aspects of the temporal lobes, there's clearly a difference in the connectivity of these particular components in the meditators versus the control subjects. Okay, well, I hope I've given you a sense that there is clearly a functional change in the brain of people who are undergoing meditation. The question is, what about the longer term impacts? Because as you may recall, the EEG studies suggested that in very experienced meditators, there were changes functionally noticed even in the non-meditating state. And so this would imply longer term changes. And this is, I think, a very interesting paper that looked at the collection of studies related to imaging, structural imaging of individuals in meditation compared to controls. And here we're talking about dozens and dozens of papers over the years. I forget exactly when this came out. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago. And so this is a meta-analysis of many, many papers looking at imaging. And the bottom line is that there are clear structural changes observed in these individuals who have been meditating over time. And I'm just going to highlight a few of them. First of all, increases in blue here, the blue dots represent an increase in the volume of the structures versus red, which is a decrease. So one is the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex. And as you can see, you can read these on your own, but this is an area that has been connected with the function of introspection and metacognition, processing of complex abstract information, integration of various cognitive processes that serve higher order, more complex human behavioral goals. Another is the insula, which I already referred to as something that's been observed to have changes in meditators. The insula is involved in awareness of one's own internal states, emotional self-awareness, and again, metacognition. And finally, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, again, which I've already referred to and I'm going to come back to. And this has clearly been implicated in the process that we call self-regulation or self-control, involved in understanding the bottom-up and top-down processes and making decisions or processing the valence that one has top-down versus bottom-up, and allowing us to adapt our behavioral responses in the moment. So I hope I've shown you that there is a suggestion that there are clear functional changes in the brain during meditation and even over the long term. And here, data that suggests that the structure of our brain actually changes with these practices. Now, let me turn to a very cool series of studies that here at UCSF, our own Helen Wang has been working on. She's been very interested in meditation and using neuroimaging to understand the process. And what she's come up with is essentially, well, what her hypothesis was is that if we carefully study using neuroimaging techniques, people who are meditating during meditative practice, that there should be something unique about the different mind states within a meditation sitting. So that's what she endeavored to try to understand. And she came up with this idea that during meditation, again, from our own experience, we know that there are these different states. So even in that 1 minute that we sat together and tried to focus on our breath, our mind is undergoing various changes. Unless you're an expert meditator and you were able to completely be focused on your breath that entire minute. I certainly can't. But anyway, during meditation, we may be focusing on breathing, depending on the meditation. But then your mind wanders and you start thinking, oh, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? Well, you try to bring your mind back to breath. Okay, so then you're back focusing on your breath. Then you start getting a little bit sleepy, certainly if it's a longer meditation sit for 20 or 30 minutes, then maybe hopefully back to your breath, but then you start thinking about world peace. But the whole point here is that our mind undergoes different states even when we're attempting to meditate. So what Helen did was take a group of meditators and have them undergo their meditative practice while in the scanner, and then after the session would ask them about what their reflection was on the time of their meditative practice. So they'd ask them, so how did it go? And they might say, well, I was quite focused for the first 3 minutes, and then my mind started wandering, and then I came back to my breath, and so forth. And the idea is that by using multivariate fMRI, which both gets the spatial information, but also multiple time points during the meditative practice, that she might be able to identify the differences in the mind state during meditation. And what she's looking for is kind of a fingerprint of each individual, which would enable one to understand better, again, what their particular meditative practice is about. And so, for example, I've already alluded to the insula as being something in which we, when it gets activated when we attend to our breath. And I've also mentioned the default mode network in mind wandering. So the idea then is to give individuals instructions while they're in the scanner, and then have them go through these different states. So you'd be in the scanner and Helen would say, okay, now I want you to pay attention to your breath. Now I want you to pay attention to your feet. You can stop now, which would be mind wandering, and then think about past events, and then pay attention to a sound which they're going to play while in the scanner. So these are the different mind states that individuals would experience, and Helen looked at the activation in different parts of the brain. And what she found, maybe to no surprise, because I'm telling you about this, is that in fact her hypothesis is correct. By using machine learning and looking at the imaging, she was able to come up with the patterns of activation in each individual meditator that could discriminate between these 5 mental states. And this is just an example of one of those. And her findings were reported in a paper that just came out last year, in which she studied a number of meditators and controls. And this is just an example of the main findings. And I won't go into the detail here, but what you're seeing are the distinct patterns for 2 meditators and 2 controls in which they were asked to go through the breathing state, the mind wandering state, and sort of self-reflection state while in the scanner. And again, these were unique fingerprints, if you will, for each individual. Helen is now exploring what the differences are in more experienced meditators versus controls. And that's a paper that I'm awaiting to see. I haven't seen that data yet. All right, well, let me turn then to a brief discussion of the unconscious mind. It may seem a little bit odd, or maybe it's not even appropriate for me to consider bringing up this topic with a group of people who think about the brain all the time in their work. But I can't keep myself from doing this, because I am struck by the fact that most of us, many people, not necessarily those of us attending this morning, but many people, I don't think, pay sufficient attention to the existence of our unconscious mind. I mean, everybody knows that we have an unconscious mind. We know that there's stuff going on that we're not aware of. And Freud certainly made this an important, incredibly seminal observation about the power of the unconscious mind. But I do think it's worth reminding one another of just how astounding, how remarkable this aspect of our existence is. And for me, one of the best ways to get this across is to reintroduce the concept of cortical blindness. So, and I apologize for the many people who are already aware of this, but this was an incredibly important paper that came out back in the 1970s. And I'm just going to walk through this for those of you who are not aware of this concept of cortical blindness. So pardon me again for those of you who know it, but this is very interesting. So if there's anything that you're paying attention to during my hour with you, please focus your attention on this concept if you're not aware of it. So what you're looking at is the visual fields of a patient who had an injury to his occipital lobe, so the back part of the brain, which is responsible for processing vision. And the visual fields that you're looking at is what the patient sees, and the salmon colored on the right hand of the visual fields of the right eye and the left eye. So this is what the individual sees. And you'll note then that rather than having a complete visual field in both eyes, which is a somewhat egg-shaped pattern on each eye, this individual, because of damage to the right occipital lobe, only is only seeing part of the visual field in the right part of the brain, because his left occipital lobe is still functioning. Okay, I hope everyone's with me. So he is only seeing, he has what's called a semi-homonymous hemianopsia. He's only seeing stuff on the right side, shown in salmon. What's really interesting is he obviously is blind. He can't see in the left side of the field, and that's all this white area shown here. So one of the interesting questions that I love to ask people when we're in the same room, just to see your reaction, is what do you think the person's seeing in the left visual field? In fact, Mike, are you on?
Yes, I am, Dan.
Hey, can you, because I think we're good for time, let's ask everybody, so those of you who have chat available, I'd love for you to just write in, what is the person seeing in the left part of his visual field, right? So he's got normal vision just where the salmon is, but what do you think the experience is that the person has in the left visual field. And this is really mostly meant for the non-neurologists in the group, because I think the neurologists know the answer to this. But let's see if anyone, and don't be embarrassed. I can't see your names. Mike doesn't care. If you were my medical students, I'd be insisting that you write something down. But let's see if anyone's bold enough to write. What is the person experiencing when we asked him? So, what do you see in the areas that you can't? What do you see on the left side? We have any brave souls, Mike?
Yeah, we've got a couple of answers so far. Anxiety is one. Shadows is another. Movement of objects. Absence of visual awareness there. Light images or energy. Maybe I'll leave it at that for the moment.
That's beautiful. Thank you for those of you who gave the answers, because that's what I would expect people to hear. So I want to focus in on the people who said things like shadows or light, that there was some kind of experience in that right side, in the left side. Well, here's the real answer to this, and that is that the individual is experiencing in the left side of the world what all of us are currently experiencing out of the back of our heads. Okay, think about that for a moment. In other words, there's no experience of anything like vision. And sometimes people think there might be blackness on the left side. Well, of course, if you close your eyes, you can all do that right now, you're actually seeing blackness. That's what I'm seeing. But that's very different than what I'm currently seeing out of the back of my head. Out of the back of my head, I am experiencing what I would call nothingness. Nothingness. So that's what this person is experiencing. But here's what we're going to do. We're actually going to do an experiment with this person. And the experiment is, I'm going to hold my fingers up in front of him, and I'm going to say, okay, when I hold my finger up, I want you to touch my finger with your hand. I just want you to reach out. Now, of course, if I put my finger in the visual field, which is intact on the right side here, he's going to see it, and he's simply going to extend his arm and touch my finger. But what happens when I put my finger in this part of the field? Now, he may say something like, Dr. Lowenstein, I'm happy to do this experiment, but you're wasting your time. I can't see your finger, which is true. He can't actually see the target. But when we do the experiment, these are the results. As you can see in the graph, what we're seeing is the difference between where I put my target in the visual field and the finger position, where the person's able to actually place the finger. And on the right side, where vision is intact, he's perfect, no surprise. But look at what happens on the left. Basically, he's able to put his finger at or close to the target. And this is far more than what it would be by chance, far more. And we call this blind sight. In other words, even though the individual cannot consciously see, he actually can see. But the vision that's intact is at the unconscious level. And another way to get this across is, all of us right now are looking at a teddy bear. It looks like may have almost lost one of its eyes, its left eye, but we're all seeing a teddy bear. But what is really, really important is that the processing, the visual processing that goes on when photons hit the retina and then go back to the occipital lobe is very, very complex. And there is a buildup that involves many different structures within the brain. And although no one can really know what those lower level precepts look like, this is just one example of how we are part of the visual processing is looking at differences in contrast. And at a very, very basic level, we build up the ultimate precept of the teddy bear with these contrast lines that then get filled in further and then eventually get colorized, if you will, into this final conscious experience. But the point here, and again, if there's one thing that I'd want you to walk away with, is to understand that the unconscious mind is this incredible, powerful, universe of activity that's taking place in our brains all the time. And using the iceberg as an analogy, I think that there's so much going on at that deeper level that is worth, pardon the phrase, worth paying attention to, because we are using it constantly in the decisions, in the behaviors that we have in our life. By definition, we can't have direct connection with it consciously, but it is very much feeding our conscious existence. And that brings me then to the third of the 4 topics, and that is just a comment on the neurobiology of racial bias. This is another talk I've put together that I've shared with our medical students here and some of our other services here at UCSF. And there's quite a robust literature in areas of psychology and sociology that are building on our understanding of the neurobiology of racism, of racial bias. But in particular, I just wanted to highlight what I think is an important connection between the biases that we carry and meditation. And I'm just going to emphasize 2 particular points. The first is that if we think about how it is that we have the unconscious bias, of which I'm assuming everyone is aware exists in all of us and is an important component of our understanding of racism, that the unconscious bias and then the regulation that we try to bring to the biases that we become aware of, that there are clearly networks that underlie this. It starts with, and I'll just focus for a moment on the bias that occurs for races that are distinguished by different colors in the skin. When we look at another person's face, we use the fusiform gyrus in the temporal lobe to make that initial identification. There's a direct connection to the amygdala, which again is vitally important for processing of emotions and evaluating a stimulus at the very initial unconscious level. And that can be the stimulus that then gives rise to fear and other forms of emotion. But then the amygdala is closely connected to the anterior cingulate cortex, and in turn connected to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which I alluded to before. And we now understand that there is this bottom-up reaction to seeing a face of a different color or someone in what would be called the out group, a top-down regulatory component from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the ACC as, again, being the structure that tries to determine the valence between the two. So these structures are becoming more well established in understanding the way biases arise. And to bring it back to meditation, here's a paper that came out a couple of years ago by, again, Helen Wang, who has done the embody task that I talked about before. And what she and her colleagues were able to show is that there are differences in activation of the amygdala in individuals who have meditative practice. And what she studied was, in particular, the way meditators and controls react to images that either depict suffering or non-suffering. And this is an example of the stimuli that were used. And this is one of the main findings from the paper. What this is looking at is the activation of the amygdala in individuals who were undergoing compassion meditation practices. And those are shown in the red dots on the right-hand side of this figure. And a group of controls who were being given the task of trying to work through some of the challenges that they were facing in life. Rather than using compassion meditation, they were using more of a psychological methodology that was unrelated to meditation itself. And as you can see, there was a distinct and very significant difference between the meditators and these control groups. And what I would suggest then is that the meditative practice, by engaging some of these really critical structures for executive control, for compassion, for regulating emotions, that these have an impact longer term, and that there's an overlay of these structures, again, with the networks that are involved in racial bias. So I guess the question is, can meditative practices be useful in our approach to trying to deconstruct the systemic racism and other forms of biases in our society? And I mean, I'll allude to what I would consider one of the greatest experts on meditative practice. This is the book, The Art of Happiness in a Troubled World by the Dalai Lama. And in it, he says, using our capacity for reason, logic, and critical analysis to combat our false beliefs, distorted views, and prejudice, these can result in messages being sent out from the prefrontal cortex that travel along neural pathways to the amygdala, inhibiting its activation. And so he says, if each of us can learn to relate to each other more out of compassion, with a sense of connection to each other and a deep recognition of our common humanity, and more important, teach this to our children, I believe that this can go a long way in reducing many of the conflicts and problems that we see today in the world. In this way, I believe that we can help create happier individuals and happier society, as well as a more peaceful world. So the Dalai Lama certainly has suggested that there's a connection between these practices, the brain structures that underlie them, and a better world. So I see I have a couple of minutes left, and so I would like to just spend a few more talking to you, and I'm gonna turn to the power of the mantram, and then we have some time for any questions and questions that you may have in my attempt to try to answer them. So I'm assuming some of you are aware of this practice, but the mantram is a technique, a spiritual practice, a meditative a technique that is available to all of us. The mantram itself is a name or a word or a phrase that one holds, and usually you stay with one phrase your whole lifetime if you can. Examples are from the Buddhist tradition, Om Mani Padme Hum, which translates into the jewel and the lotus of the heart. In the Jewish faith, it's Baruch Atah Adonai. For Hindus, it's Rama. Christian, one might say, my God and my all. For Muslims, Allahu Akbar. But again, phrases that are steeped in spiritual traditions, and you can't just choose any old phrase. Like my joke here in the Bay Area is, you can't use Steph Curry, our basketball hero. That can't be your mantra. It really has to be something that has withstood the test of time. And the idea is by choosing a word or a phrase, again, that has a spiritual connection for whatever reason for you individually, that if you always turn to your mantra in times of anxiety, when one is troubled, when you're getting frustrated, standing in line at Safeway, when you're preparing to give grand rounds before you go in to see a patient. There's just value in saying your mantra silently to yourself. And I think of it as a sort of a runghold, something that I can always grab onto, regardless of the situation, that can keep me from being swept in one direction or another, which I think is what the practice of meditation is capable of doing over the longer term. But I just want to share this with you because if you've heard about it, I would really advise you to think about learning more about the use of the mantra. And here's a a description of its power from a teacher that I came across, Eknath Eschwaran. And what he says is it's a short, powerful spiritual formula for the highest power that we conceive of, whether we call it God or some ultimate reality or the self within. This doesn't have to be hyper-religious, but whatever it is, the mantram is really calling up what is best and deepest in ourselves. And what I think he's saying there in part is that the mantram, like other meditative practices, are capable of bringing us closer to our unconscious mind, the existence of the unconscious mind that we all carry around. And even though we may not be able to consciously understand what is going on below the surface, that doesn't mean that we can't strengthen the connections that we have between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And with that, I'm going to say namaste and thank you. And I will stop my slides and come back to you, Mike, and see if we have any questions or observations that people may bring. I'm learning along the way as well. So,
thank you, Dan. Wonderful talk. There are a few comments coming through. One from Grace Chen from our neuro-oncology team. She's got a comment: for racial bias and race issues, highly recommend Caste by Isabel Wilkerson and My Grandmother's Hands by Razvan Menakem. I have a comment. There's a guy over at UW, Chester Moritz, who's working on cortical-based grid technologies to bypass areas of damage, say in the spinal cord, and link cortical signal to motor units in the anterior spinal cord or otherwise. And what they found is they didn't have to get the grid right over, say, primary motor cortex to get function in the lower muscle units if they bypass the spinal injury. They found that they could get other areas, even parietal, that could trigger motor activities after the patient had visualized and worked on sort of some of these mindfulness techniques on moving and imagining movement. And it strikes me that some of the mindfulness must somehow harness into these networks of plasticity. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, Mike, that gets to the those papers that the meta-analysis of neuroimaging, which I think shows virtually without a doubt that there are structural changes that occur in the brain. And those structural changes, I mean, there is a molecular and cellular basis to the changes in structure. So I think that's indicating the enormous amount of plasticity that exists even in the adult and older adult brain. So the area of research that you're discussing, that you just mentioned, is really, really exciting, and I'm not surprised that and we know, as you know, there's a robust literature on an enormous amount of plasticity that can take place in the brain after various forms of injury. Studies in non-human primates, for example, that show the way the parietal lobe can take over cortical regions that were previously devoted to a particular digit that was then amputated, and how the plasticity can allow new functions to take over. So I think it's not entirely surprising, but a really, really interesting application of brain plasticity to those who have had injuries such as the severity that comes from spinal cord injury.
I guess another question would be along the lines of the people who are most or least likely to perhaps be mindful in a neurodevelopmental model, and not to disparage teenagers, but it seems like there are developmental times where perhaps we really aren't mindful. And what does that mean about our abilities in our subconscious brain in those times, in myelination and development of pathways and regressive pathways and so forth?
That's a really interesting question, and whoever raised that has had the experience of raising teenage kids. I don't know the answer. I would say that similar to to the fact that there is a critical period in brain development related to all sorts of functions. Visual system, for example, we all learned in our basic neuroscience course that there's a critical period for the development of vision that is capped, fairly early in childhood. And if one doesn't take advantage of that plasticity during that time, one will not develop that capability. So I think it's reasonable to say that the enormous plasticity that's going on in terms of myelination of especially the frontal lobe in teenagers all the way through the late 20s is a critical period of development. And I can imagine that the impact of practices such as meditation would be the greatest and have the longest lifelong effects if done during that time. The problem is, for those of us who have raised teenagers, getting them to do something like meditation has got to be one of the most challenging things in the world. But yes, I would think that the more we can do to develop this ability for focusing one's attention and self-regulation, the better. But I'll go back to what I said right at the beginning of the hour, which is I think the iPhone and these devices that have connected us in a what I think is a truly, it's historic what's happened to human behavior because of the existence of these new connectors to a world of information and interaction that we've never had before. I think it's a real threat, in fact, to our ability to achieve this type of quiet mind and self-regulation.
Couple more comments from Kitty Kaiborbun on our epilepsy team. Dan, wonderful talk as always. For some of you who are interested, Thai Temple in Woodinville has meditation every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Kitty's got a web address if you'd like more information on that. A second comment from Arturo Rodriguez. What's the effect of meditation in the brain-derived neurotrophic factor?
Yeah, so great question, because I think what you're suggesting is that what you're pointing to is the fact that if we do see brain plasticity, BDNF has been shown to have an important role in neuronal plasticity. I don't know the answer, but I know that I came across a title of a paper. I was trying to update my reference list on meditation last week in preparation for this talk. And I know that there's at least one paper related to BDNF measurements, somehow related to meditation. So I apologize for not knowing that, but if you do a PubMed search on BDNF and meditation, I think you'll be able to find it.
There's another comment in terms of it basically alludes to maladaptive mantra use in terror, basically. Using a religious phrase and an act of terror as a confidence thing, and just a comment about that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I saw that question. What users of the mantra are choose something that has a spiritual connection, and the phrase Allah Akbar, it is completely analogous to the other phrases in other religious traditions, and these can be both used and very much abused, all of them in one way or another. So I really want to just stay focused on the idea that if you're going to use a mantra, you should choose something that for whatever reason connects with you spiritually, and to stick with it.
It looks like we've got two more questions, and then we'll tie it up. From Tom Dool from our neurohospitalist team. He's wondering if long-term intense meditation has adverse effects, or over meditators. Is there a toxicity to it, basically?
Yeah, so really good questions. I know from my own learning of meditative practices over the years that this is an issue that comes up with people who enter into meditation. Some individuals have a welling up of difficult, challenging, even emotionally frightening experiences during meditation. I don't understand this well enough to speak to it. I don't believe that there's a literature on this as it relates to the underlying neurobiology.
And then let's make this the final question from George Lopez from our neurohospitalist and stroke teams. Any thoughts about Qigong breathing as a form of meditation?
No, I don't know that technique well enough to be able to comment on it. My own particular practice is passage meditation, which is to choose longer, again, in one way or another, spiritually connected passages as a focus during the sitting time.
Well, Dan, thank you so much again for coming to talk with us. It's always wonderful to have you at Swedish. You helped us years ago in some of our Swedish CMEs on epilepsy. It's just wonderful to have a great colleague and friend back with us again. For those of you who want CME credit, you'll see in the chat box on the SSF links to text your data to claim your credit. And thank you all for your time. Wonderful talk. Thanks again.
Thanks all.